Liftoff. We're off on the hour.
The exploration of space, like the exploration of life, if you will, is a risk. We've got to be willing to take it. Eugene Cernan, astronaut.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
The Gemini mission was a bridge between the Mercury and Apollo programs to achieve the momentous goal of putting a man on the moon. It existed as a frontier of space technology and manned space travel. The program began as a result of the space race, which was a rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union, which was the USSR, during the Cold War in the form of a competition to see which country had scientific superiority over the other. In the space race, the US initially launched the Mercury program to compete with the USSR, which launched its Sputnik and Vostok programs. The USSR achieved the feat of placing the first man-made object into low Earth orbit with the Sputnik program, and then proceeded to successfully launch and retrieve the first manned mission into space with their Vostok 1 mission on April 12, 1961. Despite the apparent failure of the Mercury mission and the considerable lead that the USSR had obtained during the space race, later on that year, on May 25th, US President John F. Kennedy announced the USA's intention to become the first country to successfully land humans onto the surface of the moon. To achieve this goal, the US announced the Gemini program in 1961 in order to test the operations that would be necessary for sending someone to the moon, including prolonged exposure to weightlessness, spacewalks, docking procedures, and more. The Gemini program began with Gemini 1, which was an unmanned launch that was intended to test the newly designed Gemini capsule, which now had space for 2 people instead of the 1-person capacity that the previous Mercury capsule had. It and many other Gemini parts were made by McDonnell Aircraft, and it also tested out the newly modified Titan II launch vehicle. The next mission in the program, Gemini 2, which, like Gemini 1, was unmanned, however, unlike Gemini 1, stayed suborbital, which allowed NASA to test the limits of the heat shield on the capsule. The Gemini 2 rocket would also be reused in later spaceflight missions. Gemini 3 was launched on March 23, 1965, and it was the first manned Gemini mission. Its crew included Gus Grissom and John Young. The tensions were high, the weather was clear, and the Gemini 3 launch was a huge success. The mission was a key test for space maneuverability since it was the first US spacecraft to be able to fire its thrusters and change the size of its orbit. Gemini 3 circled the Earth in low Earth orbit a total of 3 times before landing. Just 3 months later, Gemini 4 launched in June 1965 with astronauts Ed White and James McDivitt. Gemini 4 lasted 4 days in total and circled the Earth 66 times, making it the first US flight to approach the 5-day manned spaceflight record that was set by the Soviet Vostok 5 mission. Gemini 4 also achieved the first US spacewalk, or EVA, which was conducted by Ed White. Spacewalks were an integral part of the eventual trip to the moon in the Apollo 11 mission. The Gemini 4 mission also included the first, albeit unsuccessful, US attempt at a rendezvous procedure in space when McDivitt maneuvered close to the separated Titan II thruster stage. Gemini 5 was an endurance test mission which started on August 21, 1965 and lasted 8 days in total, which broke the previous longest manned spaceflight record set by the USSR with Vostok 5. Gemini 5 was piloted by L. Gordon Cooper Jr. and Charles Conrad Jr. The original mission for Gemini 6 was to have 4 dockings with the Agena targeting vehicle. However, on October 25, 1965, a catastrophic event occurred. The Agena targeting vehicle had blown up. 50 minutes later, the Gemini mission was cancelled. However, this tragic event made room for a similar idea that would achieve the same effect. The revised plan for Gemini 6 was to rendezvous with Gemini 7 only 11 days after Gemini 7's launch. They came just 30 centimeters apart from each other, close enough to dock. This plan changed little of Gemini 7's original plans, which were to test the effects of space on humans. However, This plan required Gemini 7 to stay in space for 13 days, which was the longest spaceflight by far. This would be crucial for the upcoming Apollo mission, where the longest would be a 12-day mission. Where Gemini 6A failed, Gemini 8 set out to succeed. Gemini 8 was the sixth manned Gemini spaceflight, launched on March 16, 1966. It was flown by Neil A. Armstrong and David R. Scott. The goal was set high for Gemini 8. It was to be the first space docking of history. Once again, it was meant to dock with the Agena target to ensure. The second priority of the Gemini 8 mission was to practice spacewalks, or EVAs, which would be essential to the Apollo missions. Scott was able to make the second spacewalk of the U.S. missions after Ed White's first spacewalk on Gemini 4. They quickly achieved their first goal of docking with the Agena target on March 16, 1966. This was also quickly followed by the first life-threatening emergency in space. The Agena target and the capsule began spinning and gyrating. Armstrong tried to use the Gemini thrusters to stop the roll, but it started again worse this time. Soon the instrument panels became difficult to see. Both the astronauts were afraid that the Agena target vessel would blow. The problem showed itself to be caused by one of the Orbital Altitude and Maneuvering Systems thrusters, or OAMS for short, which were created in Gemini 3. Armstrong quickly activated the RCS rockets and deactivated the OAMS thrusters to stop the dangerous spin. This incident had been both a step backward as well as a step forward, as the mistake never happened again. The objective of Gemini Mission 9 was, once again, to dock with the Agena target. This had already been accomplished on the Gemini 8 mission, but not without its failures. This time they wanted to set it in stone. The second objective was still the same as Gemini 8's, which was to practice a spacewalk or other extravehicular activity. Once again, the Agena target vehicle malfunctioned and failed to reach orbit. However, this time they had a contingency plan in place, which was the Augmented Target Docking Adapter, which was launched on June 3, 1966. This launch went successfully thanks to previous attempts. Gemini 10 had multiple goals, which were to achieve rendezvous and docking with an Agena targeting vehicle, successfully complete a period of extravehicular activity, and planned to dock with the battery-dead Gemini 8 Agena targeting vehicle. The Agena vehicle launched perfectly this time, after a history of unsuccessful launches in 6, 8, and 9. Gemini 11 shot for the stars with its objectives. It was crewed by Neil Armstrong and William Anders. This would be the last Gemini mission Neil Armstrong would fly, but not the last mission he would go on, as he saw further success in the Apollo missions and was the first man on the moon. Gemini 11 would be the first to use computer-controlled atmospheric re-entry. Its goal was to do a direct ascent rendezvous with the Agena targeting vehicle, which was the same docking system needed to land on the moon. Gemini 12 was the 10th and final crewed Gemini flight, and it ended with a bang. At the completion of the last mission, the program had still not shown that the astronauts could work easily and efficiently in space. Improved restraints were added to the outside of the capsule, and a new underwater training was to be put into place and was a staple of future spacewalk training. The pilots of the Gemini 12 mission were James Lowell and Edwin Aldrin. Furthermore, the Gemini 12 mission excelled on the topics where we were lacking, as it achieved 3 spacewalks and docking with the Agena targeting vehicle. It ended as a successful conclusion to the Gemini missions.
I thought it was, Gemini was a misnomer. It was, of course, named because it was a 2-seater and Gemini twins. I thought it should be named Janus, which I think he was the god of doorways. Gemini was really the link, the extremely important link between our first attempt to go into space, Mercury, and then our lunar program, Apollo.
The Gemini missions revolutionized space travel by increasing astronaut ability to work outside of the vehicle through underwater training, further additions to the capsule, and much more. They acted as a successful bridge between the Mercury and Apollo missions. Without the Gemini missions, the US flag would never waver on the surface of the moon today.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.